Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about the current global descent into madness. Imagine 6 months ago if somebody would have told you that the Democratic Party candidate was running on a platform of putting everybody out of work and locking them up in their homes. You probably would have said they're crazy, and yet here we are.
Sworn in come January, and we have coronavirus and the flu combining, which many scientists have said is a real possibility. Would you be prepared to shut this country down again?
I would be prepared to do whatever it takes to save lives, because we cannot get the country moving until we control the virus. That is the fundamental flaw of this administration's thinking to begin with. In order to keep the country running and moving and the economy growing and people employed, you have to fix the virus. You have to deal with the virus.
So if the scientists say, shut it down?
I would shut it down. I would listen to the scientists.
So Joe Biden says that the only way to get people back to work is to put everybody out of work, and he's going to listen to the scientists. What Joe Biden is saying is completely insane, and what's even more remarkable is that a large segment of the population agrees with him. Let's look at how this happened. Here's an interesting tweet someone sent me this afternoon. I lived 6 years in totalitarian China, and I could go anywhere I like. Now I'm back in free Europe, and I'm not allowed to travel to my parents to celebrate their 50 years wedding anniversary. But European journalists are more concerned with what's happening in Hong Kong than at home. So what we have is people in the United States and Europe imagining that they are a free society while they have less freedom than communist China. Back in January, China released videos of people collapsing and dying in the streets from some new novel coronavirus. This Chinese propaganda was widely distributed by Fox News, CNN, and many other news organizations, until they drove the Western world completely mad. Then China started releasing videos of people being locked into their homes in Wuhan, China. This is where the idea of the lockdown came from, which Joe Biden is currently promoting. Of course, Joe Biden isn't suggesting that people be welded into their homes, but the basic idea of the lockdown is the same. A few weeks later, Chinese Twitter bots started releasing lots of propaganda showing how China had defeated the virus. Locking people in their homes and spraying the streets with some sort of chemical had made the virus disappear. The fix was in. The Chinese government had terrified the Western world with pictures of people dropping dead in the streets. It then showed that the way to make the virus disappear was to lock people up in their homes. And now China is releasing more propaganda showing giant pool parties in Wuhan, no masks, no social distancing. The lockdowns worked. And of course the Western media happily picks up all the Chinese propaganda and infects the minds of people all over the Western world. Dr. David Samadi made this tweet a few days ago. Wuhan, China is holding massive pool parties while New Yorkers aren't allowed to go to a gym and exercise. Something is very wrong here. Yes, there is something very wrong here. The Western world are victims of Chinese propaganda. A few countries refused to lock down. They refused to violate the human rights of their citizenry. One of them was Sweden. Sweden has achieved herd immunity. Look at all those happy people sitting at a restaurant not wearing any masks. Let's compare what's going on in Sweden to what's going on in Victoria, Australia. There's no scientific basis to the idea that you can make a virus disappear by locking people up in their homes or forcing them to wear masks. We're going to discuss that now. But first we're going to spend a minute looking at this propaganda from Barron's trying to discredit Sweden. Sweden has developed herd immunity after refusing to lock down. Let's look at the language there. Barron says that Sweden refused to do what the Chinese communists told them to do. Sweden refused to base their policy on the Chinese propaganda, which most of the Western world took to heart. Then Barron's went on with even more propaganda. Sweden has seen 5,810 deaths from COVID-19, which is much more than its neighbors, so the approach has come with a cost. The reality is that comparison is propaganda. Sweden's actually only seen about 3,000 excess deaths this year, and by the end of the year that number will be pretty close to zero. The majority of people who died in Sweden were old, sick people in nursing homes, and many of them would have died this year anyway. Like many other countries, Sweden did not do a great job protecting their nursing homes, but their younger population has fared quite well. Now let's look at the actual numbers of COVID-19 deaths per million. All of the blue bars are places which locked down, and then there's Sweden in red, which didn't lock down. Sweden had lower death rates than New York City, New Jersey, New York State, Massachusetts, Connecticut, San Marino, Louisiana, Rhode Island, Belgium, the District of Columbia, Peru, Mississippi, Andorra, Michigan, Illinois, Spain, the United Kingdom, and Italy. Death rates in Sweden, where they didn't lock down, are about 1/7 what they were in New York City, where they did lock down and they mandate masks. This data is actually a few days old. The United States is about to pass Sweden for the overall death rate. Barron's magazine claims that Sweden did much worse than their neighbors. Apparently they don't consider Italy, the United Kingdom, Spain, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, or many other countries to be Sweden's neighbors. Perhaps the people at Barron should actually look at a map of Europe. Now let's look at a comparison of daily deaths per million in New York State and in Sweden. Both New York State and Sweden have reached herd immunity. Both places are having very few cases and very few deaths now. But New York State did it at a much higher cost than Sweden. New York locked down, destroyed their economy, crime is rampant in the streets, and the people with money have fled the city. Looks to me like life in Sweden is a lot better than it is in New York. The man behind Sweden's strategy, Dr. Anders Tegnell, says that the rest of the world went mad with lockdowns. Bloomberg described what Sweden did as a coronavirus experiment. But the reality is that Sweden did what's always been done with epidemics. It was the rest of the world that engaged in a mad experiment, and this experiment was driven by propaganda coming straight out of communist China. From the Bloomberg article, Tegnell also advised against using face masks, arguing that there's little scientific evidence they work. And he says it's clear that closing down schools was an unnecessary response to the pandemic. Tegnell's underlying argument is that COVID-19 isn't going away anytime soon, meaning sudden, severe lockdowns will ultimately prove ineffective in addressing the longer-term threat. And that is exactly the problem. The virus is not going away until it spreads through the community and people develop immunity. The original idea of lockdowns was based on the idea that we just needed to flatten the curve for 2 weeks in order to keep hospitals from getting overwhelmed. But now we have people like Joe Biden believing that the virus will simply disappear if we lock the country down again. It doesn't make any sense, and you have to wonder which scientists are telling him this nonsense. Dr. Fauci says that New York State did everything right and Sweden failed because of their high death count, even though Sweden's death count was much lower than New York. And as far as schools go, keeping them closed is not based on science. Death rates in the United States for people under the age of 25 have been below normal this year. And the director of the CDC says that flu is 5 to 10 times deadlier for children than COVID-19.
Districts will begin to wrestle with this. I think it is important to try to be factual as we go through this. When we look at right now the mortality of this particular COVID virus, in the first almost 218,000 people we looked at February to July, there was 52 individuals under the age of 18. And if I recollect, about 35 were actually school age. Some of them were younger than school age. We're looking critically at those individuals, and clearly there's an increase in comorbidities related to significant medical conditions that we've already assessed. But I think that's important because what that means actually is the risk per 100,000 so far, into the outbreak, 6 months into it, is in fact that we're looking at about 0.1 per 100,000. So another way to say that, it's 1 in a million. And I'm not trying to belittle that. I'm just trying to make sure we look at it proportional, because if you do the same thing for influenza deaths for school-age children over the last 5 years, they're anywhere from 5 to 10 times greater. So I want people to understand the risk properly as they make that decision. And obviously influenza, we also benefit from having therapy and a vaccine. So I don't want people to overestimate the risk of serious illness to individuals that are school age.
It's also known that it's very rare for children to pass the virus to adults. So the argument that students are going to kill their teachers is not based on science. Sweden never shut down their under 16 schools, and they reported no problems as a result. Joe Biden says that scientists tell him that we need to lock everybody up and put them out of work. But the reality is that Joe Biden is getting his information from Chinese propaganda, not from actual scientists. The health chief of Greater Manchester, England says government COVID-19 measures are causing more damage than they're saving lives. He says the chances of eradicating the virus are virtually nil due to the national approach. Intelligent people all over the world understand that you can't make a virus disappear by locking people up in their homes or forcing them to cover their faces. The only way to reduce the threat of a virus is to develop widespread immunity throughout the population. The Chinese have successfully taken down the Western world with their propaganda. It's a pretty impressive campaign they pulled off. Toto doesn't watch television, and he understands that the only way this propaganda campaign worked was because people sit at home and they watch Fox News and CNN. He thinks that people should turn off their televisions and start using their brains. You can visit him on the web at realclimatescience.com.